We're delighted to be here today, and thank you all for joining us. As described, today we're going to be exploring how do we bring about child-friendly, playful cities, and we're really pleased to be joined by a wonderful panel of people with very contrasting and interesting experience and perspectives on exactly that question. We hope that today will be an informal conversation. So as Andrew says, throughout the afternoon, please do pop questions in the chat. And then after all of the quick presentations, we will invite people to come forward and ask their questions, which you can either direct to a specific panelist or ask the panel as a whole. So this afternoon, we are joined by a stellar list. We have Tim Gill, who is an independent writer and global advocate for children's outdoor play and mobility. We have Riccardo Conti, who is a qualified architect and founder of Catalytic Action, who work with vulnerable groups around the world. Patterson, who's social pedagogue and a child's rights specialist, currently leading on how to embed children's rights into policy at Cardiff Council. Beth Cooper, who's an independent play consultant and specialist who works with Timberplay, creating amazing outdoor play spaces for children and young people. Florian, Foerster and Joanna Hedley-Smith, who are both engineers at Buro Happold Engineering and really push the boundaries of innovative art and play. And finally, my co-founder, Matthew Springett, co-founder of MATT+FIONA, who are an organisation who aim to support young people to have their say in their built environment. So without further ado, I think we're going to come to Tim's presentation. As I say, do please drop questions or comments into the chat as we go, and we will pick most of those up at the end unless something seems really urgent. Thank you so much, and over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and I'm going to dive straight in and put some slides up. And so really, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of my book, Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities. And when we're thinking about children's lives and in their relationship to the city, I think one place we can start with is our own childhoods and the childhoods of previous generations and how things have changed. And my next slide, this map, speaks to that. What it shows is what you might call the roaming range, or the home territory of 4 children. They're 8 years old, but they're in 4 generations of the same family, and they all grew up in the same city. So what this shows is how the roaming range shrinks with each generation, in some cases quite dramatically. And so, you know, whereas the great-grandfather in this family at the age of 8 could travel 6 miles, 10 kilometers across the city on his own, the son in this family just a few years ago is actually allowed to go to the end of his street, and that's more of a kind of right to roam than most 8-year-olds are given. So what this, I think this is a powerful, compelling starting point for a conversation about children's relationship to the city. Why is this happening? It's complicated, but one of the reasons is the kind of built form of cities. And this also speaks to children's appetite for experience, that children of all ages want to get to grips with the people and places around them, understand how the world works and their place in it, and to figure out, you know, what they can do. And so when we then ask ourselves, well, how do we cater for that appetite for experience, typically in a city? Well, all too often the model that we use, and sometimes the actual facilities, look like this one. Okay, this is a particularly woeful example, but I'm also going to suggest that it's the wrong model. Okay, if we really want children to gradually expand, discover, explore, understand the people and places around them, we cannot rely solely on reservations, however well designed. They may have a part to play, and I'll say that. And instead, I'm going to offer you a different model, which is that a child-friendly place has 2 components. This diagram shows you, on the one hand, it's about having a lot of choice and variety in a neighborhood. So we're talking about the physical properties of neighborhoods. So a child-friendly place is a place with lots of choices of places to go and things to do. But also it's a neighborhood or a place where there is a lot, where it's easy for children to get around, crucially to get around on their own, on foot, or by bikes. And it's only when you've got both of those things going on that you're in that child-friendly segment. So I'm going to briefly share with you one place that I provocatively call perhaps the ultimately child-friendly neighborhood. It's the neighborhood of Vauban in the outskirts of Freiburg in Germany. It's quite a large district. It's quite green, as you can see from that overhead. But what really marks it out is that at ground level, it's in effect a car-free development. So that means all of the space that we typically allocate to moving and parked cars is available for public use. So you see a lot of playful features in Vauban, not very many playgrounds, but play offers are woven throughout the space between the buildings. And here's a couple more examples. The streets are indeed lively and vibrant places, as anyone who's been to Vauban will tell you. And just to kind of tie things up a bit, you can own a car if you live in Vauban, but if you do, you have to park it in one of a couple of peripheral car parks. There is also great public transport, which of course reduces the need and demand for car access in the first place. So that's a kind of lighthouse. It's not a blueprint, but it's indicating a kind of direction of travel. Now, why does this idea matter? In really brief terms, I spoke to a few cities around the world in the course of writing my book, and really wanted to hear from city leaders why these are all cities that have taken seriously that vision. And I wanted to know why. And as this Venn diagram shows, there were, roughly speaking, 3 broad answers people gave to that question. Why does child-friendly planning matter? A bunch of cities talked about children's rights and health and well-being. A bunch of cities talked about sustainability and community, and really this insight that what does a sustainable place look like? It looks a lot like a child-friendly place. It's compact, it's green, it's easy to get around. And then there's a third group of cities that actually talked about quite hard-nosed issues around economies and demographics, and that in short, a city that cannot attract and retain families is a city whose long-term prospects are bleak. So, but what's really interesting about this Venn diagram is that there's lots of cities that are in the overlaps, that can join the dots and see win-wins. I think that's a really important takeaway when we're thinking about this topic. I was also interested in thinking about playability. So I've been started to do some more thinking about kind of what types of public space do we have, and where does playability sit? So we think in very simple terms, what do neighborhoods have? They have streets, they have civic spaces, they have green spaces. Of course, playgrounds are in the mix, and some are more green than others. But what I'm interested in is sort of expanding the idea of playability well beyond playgrounds, so that we start to look at streets, other green spaces, civic spaces, to think about how we can weave in play offers. And the final sort of message on all this is that these are not technical questions. They are basically questions of values and priorities. And one of the things that I'm interested in is seeing how leaders in city building are beginning to realize the power of talking about and thinking about children as a way of building up a compelling vision for cities. And I'd hold Chris Boardman up as an example of that. And so remember that Vauban that I was talking about. In Vauban, it's children of all ages, with and without their parents, are very active and visible in that neighborhood. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that that's a sign of the health of that habitat, in the same way that if you see salmon swimming up a river, it's a sign of the health of that habitat. And I think that's the strongest message I can give about how we can make the kind of strategic case for more playful, child-friendly places. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Such a compelling case there, and I love the metaphor you end with around that you could judge the health of a city based on the number of children you see out and about. Also fascinating to see The roaming distances, I knew they decreased. I didn't realize it was quite to that extent. It's really quite shocking. And maybe something that I'd be intrigued to ask you at the end is around, has that appetite for experience changed, do we think, in children, or is the same level of appetite there, as long with those external factors? That really fascinating talk, and a brilliant way to kick us off in thinking about not just how we can bring about child-friendly playful cities, but why we should be doing so.
I think also, oh, sorry, Fia, I was just going to jump in, picking up on that last point, Tim. I think also this idea of seeing young people as sort of advocates for change. We're really seeing that in the power of that in transforming kind of the way we're thinking about cities, particularly when adults often have kind of more conservative agenda.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Fia, over to you.
No, great. So now let's pivot to the work of Riccardo Conti, who's founder of Catalytic Action. Catalytic Action has been advocating for many years for children's participation to co-design built interventions that answer their needs and aspirations, with a lot of work focusing on Lebanon and working with refugees. So I think it's really lovely to now move to this moment of looking specifically at how can we create these spaces, and particularly working with young people. So Riccardo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. I will start by briefly introducing the charity. So what we do is we use design and architecture to empower vulnerable children, young people, and their communities. And we achieve this through build and research projects that are delivered using a participatory approach that engages the local communities. As of the end of 2023, we implemented 47 build projects, 24 research projects, and directly engaged over 2,400 children and youth in participatory design activities. We started promoting safe play spaces for vulnerable children back in 2015 with this playground project for Syrian refugee children living in Lebanon. And since this very first project, we decided to adopt a participatory approach to design. And so we developed a set of participatory design methods and tools that we now use in all our projects, and that are really important to ensure fun and meaningful participatory engagement for all children. Since 2015, our work in Lebanon has evolved to promote play in different urban settings. Today, I will quickly show 4 examples on how we integrated play in different cities across Lebanon. And the idea behind this project was always to promote play outside playgrounds. And this is particularly important in Lebanon, actually, because for many children, they just don't have the time or resources to access the few playgrounds that are available. The first example is this public stairs that we rehabilitated in response to the Beirut port explosion. The project aimed at fixing damages, improving accessibility, and also enhancing social activities. The design incorporated different playful elements while also improving safety and accessibility for a wide range of users. And so, for example, here we can see in this handrail, it is a handrail, but it's also a speaking pipe. So you can play with it, and there is also these colorful spheres that were painted by the local residents that anyone can spin as they go up and down the stairs. We also added seats and some playful shades, and a slide, which was a request from one of the children who participated in the co-design activities. And that was quite interesting, actually, to mediate with the local municipality to convince them that this was appropriate and wouldn't have ruined the function of the stairs. The second example is a project on a waterfront in Elmina in Tripoli. In this project, we created 3 separate playful stations along the waterfront. And in each station, we add slightly different elements that encourage play for also different age groups. We delivered this project with local researchers who are hired from the local community and worked with us throughout all the project phases, including public engagement and also the collaboration with the local municipality. The third example is a project rehabilitating the streets connecting two existing public facilities in Carantina, the Carantina Public Park and the Carantina Hospital. In this project, we worked on making streets safer for children, mostly by enlarging the sidewalks and slowing down the traffic. But also we integrated different playful features such as floor games and playful benches. The last example is what we can call maybe a residual space, which in this case was this gray and very uninspiring wall, which became a sort of 3D mural with different seating elements, a shade, mirrors, and other playful features that were chosen by the participants. Here you can see some of these features in a bit more details. And actually, this space is only one of the outputs of a one-year-long project working with teenage girls in Beirut to address gender inequalities in public spaces. And here you can see some of the snapshots from the different co-design activities that led to the implementation of these and the other public spaces in the neighborhood of Carantina. I want to conclude very quickly by sharing this guide. I think it's relevant for today's discussion. It was done in partnership with ARUP, Placemaking X, and the Lego Foundation. And the aim of the publication is to inspire practitioners to incorporate play in cities. And so the guide gives different ideas in actually 15 different city spaces, as well as case studies and reflections on how to trigger different types of play for different age groups as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riccardo. Really inspiring work, and selfishly, there's lots of crossover, I think, with the work that we do, and so it's really lovely to be stretched and to see how far-reaching these kind of projects can be. Lots of really important points you bring up. One in particular is around the impact that involving young people and children in the design of their spaces can have, not just in terms of the built environment that's created, but in the terms of the lives of those young people and the legacy of the projects, which is something that feels really important not to be overlooked. And I think your work also highlights the I suppose the big question in terms of play around offers for different people, different age groups, different demographics, and ensuring that there's an offer for everyone, and how risk comes into that. So I'm sure that's something that many of our other speakers will also touch on, but will be interesting to return to in the discussion at the end. So thank you. Now, zooming out from kind of very specific examples, perhaps to a broader vision again, and thinking very much on kind of policy level, although surely on lots of levels, I suspect, we're going to go to Lee Patterson. So as mentioned earlier, Lee Patterson is a dedicated social pedagogue and child's rights specialist with a wealth of experience working with children and young people, and also babies, which is really fascinating. And Lee currently has a particularly interesting role working between UNICEF, Cardiff Council and other public service partners, which has culminated in Cardiff being recognised as the UK's first UNICEF child-friendly city. So lots to learn from Lee. Over to you. Lee, I'm wondering if you're unmuted. Sorry, I can't see you on my screen for a moment. I can see your slides. I can't.
Thank you very much. So afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to take part in the discussion today. As alluded to, I'm just going to touch very briefly on the policy framework, particularly in the UK and in Wales. We've got two progressive pieces of legislation which should bring to life children's rights, particularly in planning and urban design. They are the Future Generations Act and the Rights of Children and Young People's Measure. So we'll touch on a number of elements: economic, social, environment, and cultural well-being in the UK context. So I guess, what are children's rights and why do we have them? 42 articles set out to ensure that children and young people are looked after. They suffer a number of discriminatory factors. They don't have the franchise within political and formal settings, and we need to make sure that they're protected and able to flourish, have the health, education and disability and protection and provision that we set out in the UNCRC. It's important that there are a set of principles that we can embed and actually use as a framework. And in Wales, we actually did that using a guide, which is called The Right Way, which we can share in papers that the Children's Commissioner for Wales actually developed a number of years ago. It's a practical application of what we can do. There are a number of principles set out, and I'm not going to go through them. We don't have time today, but you can see them on the screen there in the childcomwales.org.uk. You can find a little bit more, but it's really important to talk about accountability, participation, and empowerment, as well as some of the other technical things. So let's move into urban planning and design a little bit. There are a number of aspects I'm going to talk about. The first is economic and well-being. We know that integrated spaces, designing safe, accessible routes to make sure that children and young people are able to access all the services such as schools and FE universities. We need to make sure that, as Tim has rightly said, that we design cities that promote independent mobility. And some examples in Cardiff of what does that start to look like. So I'll try to illustrate a number of those. Cardiff hasn't got it completely right, far from it, but I'm just going to talk about our experiences. We make sure that we've got active travel plans that recognize some of the infrastructure pressures in and around our schools. We know that school times can clog cities up, and we want to free that up and make sure we have a sustainable mode of transport in and around those precious times. We work with our social value contractors. So we give a lot of, as a local authority, we give a lot of contracts out. We want to make sure that the social value enhances our school curriculum offer. We also need to make sure that our social and well-being outcomes are improved. And what does that look like? Inclusive public spaces, encourage social interactions amongst children. We know that we've got a lot of pressure on our children at the moment. We've got isolated children. We need to promote social cohesion in times of challenge. Good planning can actually aid that. We've got designing of playgrounds, parks, but we need to think about, as Tim said, the new residential development, city centres and the wider public realm to make sure that all children, it's important to think about all children and their lived experiences, can access the services and resources of the city. They have a right to play, they have a right to association, and sometimes as a city we forget that. And sometimes we're quite punitive in how we move children on or how we see children congregated in public spaces. We need to engage with children and young people. It's a right that they have to express themselves freely on things that are important to them. And not only does this enhance our public design and make sure it meets their needs, but it's an intrinsic right that seeks to empower children and young people broadly. So in Cardiff, we don't get things right. Here's an example where we decided to build a beautiful public realm immediately outside the city centre train station, in between a wonderful BBC headquarters. And unfortunately, or fortunately for the skating community, it's a very flat skatable surface and they love to skate there. Well, skating, which sometimes can be a little bit noisy, doesn't go well with live broadcast from a BBC facility. And after speaking to children and young people, in the skate community, they said, if only people would have asked us when they were planning that space, we would have said, we're going to skate that. Why don't you put something very skatable away from the live broadcast area, and we'll just naturally congregate over towards that skatable piece of art or skatable infrastructure. Another way that we have got it right is using gamification. We know that children and young people like to articulate and express themselves in different ways. Minecraft was a way that Cardiff actually decided to do it, and we used Minecraft to enable children and young people to design a city centre park and a new cancer hospital in the north of the city. So they're two examples of doing it well, doing it not so well. Environmental and well-being outcomes we seek to improve through urban planning and design. Now, we know that green spaces, safe play areas and pollution-free environments are essential. And we're talking about the intrinsic human right about being healthy and the right to life and survival. Promoting use of eco-friendly materials and designs and construction actually improves the impact and creates healthier living spaces for children and young people. We have to remember that climate change is the biggest threat to children's health and exacerbates health disparities as set out by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2013. Examples in Cardiff, where we're working very hard to ensure that our planning guidance going forwards describes the importance of opportunities to play. As Tim has rightly said, not necessarily just in the formal setting, but across our wider new developments in our city centres. It needs to be a playful environment that respects and understands the benefits of play. And then our One Planet response in Cardiff, we're making sure that that's built into our curriculum offer so children and young people can start to explore sustainability broadly. And moving on to our final area briefly, culture and well-being. We know that good design should incorporate things like centres of culture, museums, community spaces. These spaces help for children and young people to understand and appreciate their culture and diversity. And in Cardiff, we're very proud of that. We're a Welsh capital and we talk about our Welsh language and heritage as a crucial part. So including in our urban design spaces in our city, we make sure that we've got good signage, public art and community spaces that does exactly that. And you can see some examples there of a Welsh language festival, Pride, and a literature festival. So in summary, well, integrating children's rights into the economic, social, environment and cultural aspects of urban planning is actually crucial if we're going to have child-friendly cities. We've got good legislation. However, it comes down to the implementation on the ground, project by project, that will have a real impact. And it takes excellent, well thought through designs. So I advocate all stakeholders to think about children, their rights and their needs, and let's build better cities in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Lee. A really profound insight there into how I think we can take child-friendly cities from being the exception into the norm. And you touch on so many salient points that I think often come up when people immediately hear the thought of a playful city or child-friendly city is, well, what about everybody else? And that example you gave of skateboarders, if they had been involved in that engagement process, then there could have been a way that the public realm was worked out to work for everybody. But by disenfranchising them from that decision-making process led to moments of challenge and kind of confrontation. So I think it's that in itself answers the question of exactly why we should be doing this, even if we're taking children out of it, which as someone who believes strongly in the rights of the child obviously doesn't want to, but it really makes an incredibly compelling argument.
Fia, I just want to also add to that. I think this notion of that kind of timely input is really critical. It is really lovely to hear that anecdote, but I think we're finding more and more where some of the most powerful advocacy we share, as we said, we've shared a lot with sort of practice with Riccardo, but actually where we're finding some of our, I think probably our most profound kind of impact is actually in the first stage kind of shaping of city and thinking about the brief and bringing young people in even before any moves have been made. And so it's, you know, I'm sure many of us around this table and other in the room have got similar anecdotes, but yeah, really lovely to hear.
Absolutely. Yep. And that question of are we designing for the supervised young person or the unsupervised young person, and making sure that neither group are overlooked. I can see we've got our first question come in from Karen Klomp. Thank you so much. Please, everyone else, do put questions or comments or feedback into the chat while we're going, and we'll come to those at the end of the presentations. We're currently halfway through. So next, over to Beth Cooper. Beth Cooper is the creative play consultant for Timberplay, who are an organisation based in Sheffield, in Yorkshire in England. Since completing her formal education in play, she's worked on community-based, small-scale and city-level projects, improving play. And I think what really comes across in Beth's work is also the power of play as a unifier. So I'm really excited to hear more. Over to you, Beth. Oh,
Beth, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry.
Drop out and drop back in again. You were going to come to me, so sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you now. Thanks, Beth.
Brilliant. I'm hoping. Sharing? Yes. Sharing okay? Can you see that?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So Tim's already brought it. So hi everyone. Sorry about that tech stuff, but yeah. So I've been working as a consultant specifically around playgrounds for a very long time, and Tim has already brought up this map that is often talked about in play conversations about roaming distance. And a really interesting kind of comment that somebody I heard speaking, I wish I could reference them correctly, but I can't remember where exactly I heard it, but it was quite a powerful comment, was in some ways it's not necessarily about the distance anymore, it's definitely about the quality. And I think some of the work that Riccardo was talking about with Catalytic Action and about those incidental moments, that conversation about access and routes and connectivity is really important, the work that Lee's doing as well. So whilst we are seeing culturally a real deviation from that free roaming, free expression of engagement with children's geographies that we used to see, we can actually mitigate some of that by providing that quality in the kind of immediate geography that children are interacting with, and also throughout the urban realm. There are three key foundation points that are from this definition of what play is: that it's freely chosen, intrinsically motivated, and personally directed. And in the UK, all four play associations have adopted that definition as a kind of marker of what play is. So it's not just about activities, it's about that opportunity to just engage in behaviour that they are choosing and developing with. Now, one of the things about that is previously we would see a lot more unsupervised play and, you know, kind of play where children themselves were in groups or individually playing. And those benefits that come from that awareness of others and their environment, their own strengths and capabilities, development of the brain, socialization, creativity, all these different benefits came from that free play, that enablement of time and space in which they could play. And play, absolutely, Tim, absolutely does not just happen in these play reserves, I believe you called it. I love that term. So it's not just within the playground. Play can happen everywhere: the home, the street, the woods, in and amongst friends. And the playground is only a part of that curriculum of play and that opportunity and landscape for play. And yet we know that these images of children playing on the street, beautiful. There's only one car in this image. It is not the car that is dominating this space. It is the people and the dogs and the play that is dominating this space. So we know now that spaces for play that are designated are probably more often seen as the antidote to this reduction in play. And yet a recent Fields Interest Green Space Index suggested that, you know, there are 2.3 million children in Britain living more than a 10-minute walk from the nearest playground. And that walk previously might have been more sedate, but if they're having to cross busy roads, or if there's a lack of transport, or if they have additional needs and need more supportive transport to get there, then it puts another barrier between the child and their play experience. Because we're not seeing children play immediately outside their doorstep and then grow their geography in the way that we used to. I think, Fiona, you did mention it would be interesting to see about that cultural shift. I think in my work, I've seen a number of conversations happen where You've got parents who are very concerned about the safety, this aspect of risk, this fear of danger for their children. And yet when you ask them about their childhoods, they are talking and expressing about situations where they took a lot more risks. One example is a mother who quite clearly stated she would not let her child walk alongside the canal. She felt that it was too dangerous an area. And when I drilled down into what her play experience is with, she said as a child, they used to build dens on the train tracks. So there is this kind of reduction in kind of more risky and more challenging experiences that we're seeing. And part of that is about spatial opportunity. Though those barriers, there's a disconnection in some ways between play and what play really is, and an understanding of play. I think somebody's also mentioned that kind of attitude towards play. So some of the discourse around play, not wanting groups of children being around, seeing it as antisocial behaviour rather than recognising it as play behaviour. Connection is really important. The way in which land values have increased and the development of spaces, and just that adult agenda. So children will play anywhere if they have the opportunity, if they feel that it is a psychologically safe space for them to engage in play. Playgrounds are only a part of that play experience, but where there are playful spaces, designated spaces, they must now compensate for that loss of the wild play experience. A quote that comes from Bob Hughes, a very well-respected play theorist. We're often looking at working with adults' needs at the heart of shaping the spaces, something that then I think all of the previous speakers have talked about in terms of engagement, kind of mitigating again some of that adult focus on the development of these spaces. Brilliant example of that skate area outside of the station. I think Lee mentioned this kind of sense of power, really, in terms of the children's voices. And I think it's our responsibility to recognise and then take on the baton of the fact that when we're dealing with children, when we're looking at children's needs in spaces, we're often talking about a group of people who have very little economic, political, or societal power. So it's our role to speak for them or create spaces where their voice can be heard. Just very briefly, an example of a project that we've worked on very recently in our hometown of Sheffield, which is an example of where spatial design, forward thinking, and I think bravery in terms of policy and in terms of leadership within the city has taken place. So as part of a large urban redevelopment programme, they removed a car park, and as part of the sustainable urban drainage scheme, they placed play at the centre of the city. So this is Pounds Park in Sheffield, and it is not all neat and tidy. It's a beautiful play space, but it also has some of those messy, movable, shapeable elements. And it's not something that typically you would see so close to the heart of hardscape urban realm. It's part of a huge scheme which is softening the city centre and making it a really kind of family-friendly, community-friendly space. It's working alongside with that recognition that there is a much higher density of people living within the city centre, that density of residences within the city centre, and they're taking play forward and taking really beautifully designed spaces forward to make these spaces feel playful. Equally, there are small playful interventions all the way along, lots of beautiful planting and sensory elements. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully we can get into some really good chat in a bit.
Amazing, Beth. That's really great. I love that last sort of slide and conversation about that, the sort of city centre. I think in some of the recent work with our team here, thinking about kind of the central urban fabrics and how we rethink sort of city centres, town centres, we're seeing that that kind of conversation about the not explicitly be about play, but the softening of city centres as being absolutely critical to that, and really playing to that point which you're talking about, and I know we're going to hear from other speakers about, and we have heard already, this idea of play, maybe just as in its loosest definition, as sort of open-ended inquiry of place and objects and stuff, that can happen for all ages and brings real kind of equity, I think, to our, or can bring real equity to our city centres. And fascinating stuff. Lovely.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Beth. That felt like a real kind of call to action. I found it really, your point about the bravery of clients really significant, and is definitely something we see, that it does feel that clients and commissioners are expected to or need to be brave. And I wonder, as a wider context to throw into the mix, the role that media plays, particularly in this idea around risk, that every day we're bombarded, all of us, with hearing about all the things that can go wrong in our cities and communities, but we rarely hear about those kind of moments that are going right, or paint the picture for a more positive future. And I think that kind of fear-mongering is perhaps only pushing everyone into thinking more about their own needs and not thinking collectively. So that's something I'd love us to come back to and hear more from you on, Beth. More questions coming up in the chat, which is fantastic. But in the meantime, we're going to go over to our next presentation, which is coming from Florian Foerster and Joanna Hedley-Smith. Florian Foerster is a chartered structural engineer and an associate director at Buro Happold Engineering, and their practice in structural engineering covers all phases of design, from concept through to construction, but crucially on pretty structurally complex and ambitious projects, as well as temporary art and architecture installations, which we will see. And Joanna Hedley-Smith is also a structural engineer working at Buro Happold Engineering, working in a very similar realm. And together, Florian and Joanna have been involved in a long-term collaboration with Raumlabor Berlin, in particular recently on radical playgrounds, and also working with an innovative collective of Berlin-based architects for the delivery of socially engaging art and architecture projects. So over to you, Florian and Joanna.
Okay, perfect. Oh, hang on. There we go. Thanks, Fiona. So as mentioned, Florian and I are here to talk about our involvement in the Radical Playgrounds project earlier this year in Berlin specifically, which we worked on with Raumlabor, the architects from Raumlabor in Berlin. And Florian and I provided the structural engineering advice on this series of installations. So the Radical Playgrounds are located next to the Martin-Gropius-Bau, which is an art museum in central Berlin. And the playgrounds were actually conceptualized as part of the Euros 2024 football tournament, where Berlin, as a hosting city, received funding for different cultural events alongside the tournament. And so the playgrounds were born as a result of this, which center on the theme of play and its history in urban spaces, rather than playing football, as I first assumed when I heard about the project. Now, this screen grab shows the location of the site next door to the museum, in and amongst the trees. And then these images here show the site at street level taken in March this year before the temporary playground was constructed. So usually the site is little more than a car park for the neighbouring museum. However, through the collaboration with Raumlabor and a series of artists, was transformed into a temporary fun fair, including 17 different art installations and pavilions that are for use by children and adults alike to explore.
Yeah, I'm quite happy if you leave the yellow slide on, Joanna, because that'll be great. Yeah, so I join in now a little bit of the presentation here, or discussing it. The concept was really for us to provide designed spaces, like if you would go to a children's room or you go to a toy shop, different structures where the artists then had the task. Each of these little elements has an artist associated to provide their interpretation of play, to then give it to the public for a number of months. This was a temporary structure for 3 months, to then actually fill them with the social activities of playing. It was targeted, or not targeted, was aimed at older people, parents, and children. And it was fascinating to see during the life of the structure, it's coming to the end next week, unfortunately, how it was actually taken by the different audiences. So there is a huge diversity in the individual elements. So it is a bit like a crazy little doll's house where you find one place which you like. Some areas became very popular, some others probably stayed a bit more the niche. So I'm just going to run through some of the examples, and I think what for us as designers was very, very important that in the sort of process of design, I think we try to firstly engage with an experimental way and really playful way of planning and building. This is possible with this collective of architects because it's a way of their philosophy to think. It's also possible with us at Happold, with some of the engineers we work together. It's not over-planned. We adapted very much to the site, we adapted to the materials, we changed it all. So it's not a static design which you want to put there and say the city has to leave it. And it also had, from the beginning, this temporary nature. We knew that it's there for 3 months. So the whole design criteria is a little bit different than for a permanent structure. So it gave a lot of freedom. So maybe we run through some examples here. This is on the left is a quick goes through different elements of the structure, of the playground, which already shows the different forms. Yeah, this is one where we created a 10-meter high tower. You go up in that tower. It's the artist's work with the outside painting. You go up. There's a viewing platform, so you all look over the trees, and it was linked to a walled secret garden where there were some excavations. The children could work with tools and excavate this sort of quite sacred car park ground because it's all listed. But because it was an art project, we had a bit of temporary freedom, which was very nice. That's where the children took over the activities and actually went much further than any of the adults thought, that wanted to dig deeper and deeper. So there was put some stop to it at some stage. It was very interesting that the children are often much more active, much more radical than the planning adults actually anticipate. So maybe the next slide. Yeah, here's a temporary dancing space, social space created for lots of activities during the week. You can see it's all a bit rough and ready, but I think that's what we wanted. It was designed and built in a very short time, within, I think we got the call at Christmas, and it opened in the end of April this year. We had a replica of what's called a carousel, which didn't work anymore, but it was just an arts installation where you could sit around, and it was lit at night. Next one. And you had interesting social spaces where you could close this in this meeting room in the evening. It was a totally free installation. The security aspect was very low key. There's no security guards going around. There was a couple of volunteers helping people to work things out. It was open to the night. It wasn't fenced in. So it was potentially could have gone completely away. But because of the nature of the site and the nature of the respect, I guess, and the respect and of the users and the narrative which developed, during the entire process, there wasn't any major issue with vandalism or accidents, and it was also a site which was new to experience for the parents, especially, or for the adults. You see now on the next slides. If you click on, yeah, this one, for example, this is an old playground structure from the 70s, from Switzerland, 60s and 70s. You hardly see it anymore. So you go into these tubes and you go up and down. They're quite long. Like altogether, it's about, when you go the whole crawl through the whole entire tunnel, it's about 20 meters long. So the parents can't see the kids. So they potentially get quite worried what's happening. They might have a good time inside that tunnel. So these are sort of as Joanna said, the exhibits were a little bit linked to what has been done in playgrounds. What could we do? And I have not seen a new playground where you install this scale of tube now. So this was quite fun. Next one. Yeah, we try to be very low tech, so things which we did with very little budget. Some artists wanted to construct this really brutally looking steely half pipe through skating. So there's a little video how we designed it, self-bent on site without much. So we just had a little crane to lift up this sheet. It's just a nice way that we did it, and then we see it in a minute. And then it's fixed by the welders. We did this because to buy the curve, yeah, there it is for skating. So this was also a very enjoyable way of, as a structural engineer, to use our skills to play during the design. which I think helps sometimes with loosening up a bit and not saying this code requirement, we have to stick to this code requirement, and otherwise we would never build it, and have these sort of discussions. These discussions didn't really happen. We had to understand, obviously, safety aspects a little bit, but it wasn't the dominant factor. There's a few more videos, and it was a complete collage of structural engineering, materials, social space, and that was for us a very interesting way to use our engineering skills as a tool to enable social architecture. And so that's sort of the end of our short little presentation.
I mean, just one word. Wow! I want to be there. I should know the answer to this, but does it still exist at the moment? I know you said
Till Sunday.
Until Sunday.
Sunday
You
is
get the
closing
Berlin.
day.
I better book my ticket.
Yeah, you can get on a train or get on a plane. You can do it. And no, and unfortunately, some of the things. This is the other interesting thing is with mobile playground structures. We find if they're well designed, often you find another place. Somebody comes along and say, "Can I take this and put it somewhere else?" So two of the structures maybe put somewhere else already. Two stay. And so it's a little bit in the back of our minds. We often think it's going to be put somewhere else, maybe. But
I think
unfortunately,
it's a really lovely. It draws to mind the kind of picking up on Fee's point on risk and this idea also that, well, three things from your thing that really maybe we can talk to in a little while, but the idea of play as a means of production and design, and the playful spirit in thinking about the production of space, I think is lovely from the design side of it, and we often don't hear about that enough in terms of the production of space and the joy that can bring, but also the freedom maybe of the temporary and the ability to subvert rules and codification of cities, and we often find that it's through the meanwhile interventions in place that we can be most radical, and maybe there is function for the temporary to be test bed and laboratory for a more radical, as you're doing, a more radical way of thinking about the city. And I think in the same way that Fee touched on, we, and I'm sure everyone in here finds that the clients who are taking the risk, it's also, I think, it's who holds the risk is really important. And as designers, doing things safely and appropriately, but that's in this risk-averse culture, Fee often talks about the power of owning that risk and holding it, particularly as the designers. It's critical, particularly that we lead the way in a safe and appropriate way, but that we hold that risk. And I think with everyone we've seen today as are champions of that risk holding, if you like, to make better futures. So really exciting. Hopefully we can bring some of those into the conversation.
Yeah, just to add just briefly, one of the tools which does work to circumvent too much like risk obeyance or something, is having this temporary connection with art projects, because it's very hard for certain authorities to say what is actually now the governing factor, and that helps us a lot to be a bit freer. I think that's very nice for engineers, because it brings us down to the key elements which we need to do, that the things stand up and don't fall down, but we don't get lost in too many codes, and that's a really helpful approach, I think, sometimes. But that's a sort of a secret, because authorities find it very difficult to handle artists.
Really fascinating, and that temporariness, as Lee's mentioned in the chat, can be really empowering for enabling everyone to feel that they can push the boundaries that little bit further, and maybe that builds everyone's confidence. Last but not least, it's lovely to be able to introduce my co-founder of MATT+FIONA, Matthew Springett. Matt's a practicing architect with over 20 years experience, but I can say from first hand, has a passion for play, being playful, being inventive, and for supporting and trusting young people to have a say in the shaping of their built environment. So over to you, Matt.
Hi, Fee. Thanks. Lovely. And I think I'm just going to speak briefly, like everyone else has, hopefully just for 5 minutes. And actually, I wasn't going to say this, but it struck me that well, we're amongst really amazing with some really amazing speakers, and it's been lovely to hear this kind of conversation about sort of journeys and paths. But it's I actually have a confession that when I was 5, I fell off a metal witch's hat climbing frame onto a concrete surface in one of those fantastic 70s brutalist playgrounds, and fortunately very fortunately survived. But I was actually quite seriously in hospital for a while, but had parents who continue to embrace that risk, and I think that's something which continues to this day. And I mean, I think you probably gauged the room already that my nickname in the office is Rope Man, and Fia's Brains, and I kind of hopefully bring that spirit of play to what we do. But today, I guess, thinking of all the other speakers, I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to talk hopefully a little bit more about our processes. It's rather than hopefully you're seeing that now, yeah. Rather than thinking about designing for play, because I think many of our projects are about bringing the voice of young people to shaping our places and cities, and much of that does involve play. But it's also about agency and advocacy of bringing young people's voices to, and the power of that. And lots of overlap, as we've heard from some of our speakers earlier on, but we're a young organization. Fia and I now do this full time, but it's only very recently we've done that. We've been going for 6 or 7 years now. I'm really proud of that reach. So hopefully the numbers sort of speak for themselves, but have really high ambitions for reaching many more and finding many more ways of doing that. But we're an organization that works predominantly with young people, and by young people we mean anywhere from sort of 5 to 18. And in doing that, we talk about our work in sort of 3 strands, and that's to do with about, I guess, reach and impact, and how young people voices and processes can be brought to the table to help change our places and cities. And we call that build, learn, and connect. And I'm just going to talk a little bit to each one of those. And anyone who's seen some of our work or knows of our work, it's rooted in giving people agency, in thinking about their places and spaces, historically often with what we would call cultural collaborators, to make real architectural interventions in cities, sometimes temporary, sometimes semi-permanent. And we've historically done that, as I said, with cultural organizations, some of them outlined here, but processes which bring young people's voice all the way through from the briefing process, and that timely nature of kind of when we bring young people's voices to the table is very important, through to the making. So all of our projects that you see here are made by young people over a week, and then occupied and owned by them and their communities. So for the first 4 years, when we were sort of, I guess, night shifting and doing this between our many other guys, Fi's background is as a trained architect too, but has spent a lot of time in cultural learning, leading programs, setting up programs, and leading as at the RIBA, and most recently the Design Museum in their learning programs. And bringing, I guess, youth voice to the table. But we realized during COVID that this sort of thing that we'd fallen onto, if you like, almost by accident, but by experience and of working together historically in the past, that we were seeing a desire and a yearning to bring that youth voice to the table. And Learn is about ways of as a strands of our work, which is about sharing, I guess, and about widening that reach. I think Fia often touches on that all of these learning organizations, that we've seen today and more widely, we're probably only scratching somewhere between 2 and 5% of the kind of young people in the UK. And really we need to do lots more. So our Learn strand is about training the trainer, it's about extended learning, and it's about bringing, for those particular people who cross or get involved in our projects, into wider opportunities in careers in the looser sense in the built environment. We have never been, we never set out with an ambition to be the trainer of sort of young architects or engineers, although that's perfectly fine if any of the people that get involved with us think and get inspired to do that, but more that they become much more informed and engaged citizens. And we do that with now that widening kind of work. We do that with local authorities, we do that with academic institutions and other cultural organizations. And for example, most recently, super proud of the young people's voices being part of Design Future London Challenge, reached 24,000 young Londoners. And for the very first time, our work this year has brought the youth voice to the new London plan consultation. And that's absolutely amazing, and we're super proud of that. And then connect. So if learn is about reach, connect is about I guess impact, and connect strand of our work is about connecting with the placemakers, the local authorities, the developing consortia, the developers who have the power to change our cities, and doing that through bringing youth voice to the table in that decision making. And that's often about meaningful consultation and engagement. And that, as I touched on earlier on with some of the questions, is about doing that in a timely fashion, often even before design teams have come on board. Working collaboratively and bringing youth voice into a genuine co-design processes and embedding young people's ideas into design teams, again, often about a really timely manner. And that increasingly is going from individual one-off interventions to much more strategic thinking. So often that Connect work started off with working with the amazing organisation 2 to 3 Degrees and Grosvenor, and recently has grown to much wider work of working here with Waltham Forest Council, looking at their urban design frameworks, or Phil and Craig Bradley redesigning the ceramic facade of a public-facing building, and then most recently working with Latimer in the design of a new garden community for 7,500 new homes. And really that bravery that Fee touched on earlier of bringing on a youth advocacy group that meets every month before a design team, and that's a really powerful thing to shape a brief that shapes a future and advocates for radical change. All of our work is done by an amazing dedicated team. Fee and I have a rather odd named practice, MATT+FIONA, but it's much more than just us. We started off, as I said, 7 years ago on the hoof, and rather quickly sort of has escalated, but it's an amazing team around us, not now I think really informed and enhanced by not being just architects in the room. So we have an amazing array of kind of practitioners that come from a different backgrounds, and then always the communities, and as this last slide shows, the volunteers that come together to make those projects possible in a process of collaboration and agency. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt, and hopefully a nice way to finish on the power of collaboration and the importance of everyone working together if we are going to achieve truly child-friendly, playful cities. So thank you. Now over to like to invite the audience to continue to give questions, put forward questions. We've had some wonderful ones put in the chat. Sadly, I can see that Karen has had to jump off, but because this is recorded and I think it's a really important question, we're going to start by jumping in with it, which was a question actually specifically directed to Lee. Is gender a consideration in the design planning of outdoor spaces? She says she feels it's quite often focused on boys, not necessarily intentionally, but she quotes evidence from Make Space for Girls that perhaps it doesn't work for girls, and maybe we could widen this to girls and of course gender diverse young people, and ensuring that spaces work for everyone. Lee, is that something you'd be able to respond to?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, and hopefully you'll see the recording, Karen. So absolutely right. We've got some concerns around us planning, particularly teenage girls, out of public spaces, maybe our parks. We've actually just completed. We did 5 years worth of work that saw us recognised as a child-friendly city in Cardiff, and we have a new set of priorities. 2 of those priorities are sort of a Venn diagram. One is around equal and included, looking at disparities and discriminatory practice, and we've got a particular focus on gender. And the second one is around place, urban planning and design. So we're particularly interested in, are we planning certain groups out of public spaces? We've actually commissioned and doing some joint work with Cardiff University School of Human Planning and Geography over the next year to actually understand, are we doing exactly that? First part is, are we doing that, girls? Tell us about it. Secondly, please do some co-design case studies with us. What does excellent look like for Cardiff parks? So we are trying to better understand, but we've also carried out 5 months worth of work with girls and young women and those with female experiences, which we ended up publishing a gender report, which is on our website, and I've shared the link. which looks at the pressures put on girls and young women in Cardiff, and actually some recommendations from them. It's slightly wider than planning. It's about education, it's about safety, community, etc., and aspirations and expression. But you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about particular groups and their lived experiences by gender, by ability, by disability, by ethnicity, and if we're new to the city coming from overseas. Good challenge, and Cardiff are just about to address some of the shortcomings that we're having.
Thanks, Lee. And could we maybe come to Riccardo now to also respond on that work, because it's clear that you have been finding ways to bring girls into the creation of play spaces within the public realm and spaces where girls and feel comfortable. Have you got any tips to share from how you've gone about doing that?
Yeah, so actually that project, obviously I didn't have a lot of time, so I had to go very quickly, but it's a project that we really care about because we saw this need in the community and we really wanted to address it. And actually, like, our story of that project is that at some point we decided to crowdfund to be able to do this project because we really saw the need for it. And as a tip, for us was really important the process. So I think we mentioned today to leave it open as well. So engaging with the girls in a very open process. And in our particular case, we were able to do that because the funding for that project was basically crowdfunding. So from people who support our work. In other situations, maybe there is already a brief, so you have a bit less flexibility. But I think that for this specific issue of gender inequalities in public spaces was really, really important to be very open from the very beginning. So defining everything with the girls from the mapping, addressing the issues, understanding the issues together, identifying the sites in the neighborhood, like everything was done with them. And only through that process, I think we were able to generate the impact that we were hoping to achieve.
Really interesting, and particularly that point about the agency that you had due to the funding of the project. I think everybody who's working in this realm recognises the role that practitioners sometimes have to play in a learning process with their clients or commissioners in cases where we feel that certain groups might be inadvertently being overlooked. So it's really fascinating to hear more about that and the crowdfunding process there. I think the next question we have is from Helen Taylor, and it's about the inquiry that some people might be familiar with that was happening pre-election on children, young people and the built environment. And we're actually very lucky that Tim Gill, one of our panelists, was one of the 18 commissioners, is that the right term? I'll pass over to you, Tim, to give more of an update on both the background and where it's got to. Thank you.
Sure. So I was one of those who was pushing for that inquiry and gave oral evidence and generally cheered people along to submit. And I am, just to be clear, now there's a separate process running, which is not from Parliament, it's from an influential NGO, the Centre for Young Lives, which has been set up by Anne Longfield, the former Children's Commissioner for England, which is called the Play Commission. So those are two separate things. The inquiry, sadly, did not get over the line before the election was called. I think it's fair to say some tears were shed, even though, of course, in many ways, those of us who are keen to see democratic accountability were happy to see the election being called. But anyhow, these things happen. I don't see a lot of prospect that the committee will pick up that work again. It's rare for that to happen with a new committee with a new chair. There's some scope that the Town and Country Planning Association, who are another of the people involved, who are pushing for it and who submitted evidence, will pull together some kind of analysis of the findings. But in any case, the conversation did, get taken forward. I think there are more MPs who are switched on to this issue, and we've got this new Play Commission, which has a broader remit. It's not just looking at you know, urban planning and design. It's looking at schools, it's looking at learning, it's looking at digital play. But place is going to be one focus on, and certainly I want it to be an important focus. And I think it's also just fair to say, Anne, I've known Anne Longfield for a long time. Her background is in children's services, out of school to childcare, and kind of wraparound services, and more recently as Children's Commissioner. She's learning about the built environment. So I think anything that can help her and the other commissioners understand how important place, neighbourhood design, public space is for children and young people, I think that would be really helpful. And there is an open invitation for evidence that I think is running until the end of September.
Thanks, Tim. So hopefully that's something that anyone listening who thinks that that's relevant to their work could get involved in. Thank you. Next, I think we've got Hugh Dame's question. I don't know, Hugh, would you like to unmute yourself and put your camera on and come forward and ask your question and direct it to a member of the panel?
I guess this is to any member of the panel, but Tim, maybe this might be something of particular interest or not. I work with schools using parks, and I work with them supporting the curriculum, but I use play as a way, an approach to make learning fun, get them engaged. It's an enrichment program for schools. So I'm seeing myself coming out play from one direction and using the public spaces, bringing play into public spaces with classes of pupils. And I see now you have, well, not now, but there is play in the other area, which is just play in and of itself and using public spaces. And I'm interested in how the two things can meet and join up in a way that what I do supports what you do, and what you do supports what I do, and you know, just see if there's where the crossovers are. One example might be, for example, if I set up a base camp in a park for a school, that space gets used by, it can be used by families, can be used by forest schools. It's trees are great playgrounds. Kids love making dens. It feels like there's a real space there to bring things together a bit. And I just wanted to get the viewpoint of the panelists, maybe Tim in particular, anyone really.
Shall I kick off, Fiona, and then, yeah.
That would be great. And then maybe Beth, I think perhaps that would be great if you could continue.
Yes, I'm for my sins the patron of the Forest School Association. So I fly the flag for you know, outdoor learning in the Forest School model. I'm a big fan, and I think you're right. There's real opportunities for schools to collaborate with the custodians of green spaces, nature areas, parks, woodlands, to create you know, or improve those places as both places where groups of school children or preschool children can come and do great things, and also the same simple, you know, structures, seating or clearings can then be there for public use. I've seen it happen. It's definitely possible. I think there's also an interesting question which is slightly different around public access to school playgrounds, which is, we seem to find extraordinarily difficult in the UK. It is not at all difficult in the Netherlands, or even in the USA, you know, the world capital of risk-averse, you know, and kind of fear of litigation. Many American school grounds are shared and open for public use. It really, I know there are knotty issues, but I think with some focused attention on political will and a bit of creativity, I think that could really create some opportunities in both urban areas, but also in very rural areas where the school is often the only place where children find themselves together, you know, for periods of the day. And then finally, as you hinted at, there's this sort of interest in sort of learning outside the classroom, and not just in Forest School, but in other parts of communities. I'm not close enough to the kind of curriculum to know where that's going. There are certainly agencies working on it, and I've seen some great examples from Italy, from Reggio Emilia, for example, where there's a wonderful preschool program running for decades. And I hope that with the new government, we might see a climate in schools and in education that is just a bit more open to some creative and progressive thinking, and where play is not a dirty word, which I think it was for some years in DFE.
Thanks, Tim. Beth, do you have any tangible examples from your work of where you're finding this crossover in learning and space happening?
Yeah, in terms of space, when I first started working with Timberplay, there was a really beautiful example in Wales where, I mean, I think the context of Wales is quite different. Wales are beautifully passionate and create a statutory requirement for play, again in Scotland, and in England we have this real kind of paucity of value for you know, dare I say, both children's rights, but also, you know, creating that space and healthy development and support for children, which I do hope is going to change. And I think Tim was working really hard with a really amazing group of people about stuff that has been in conversation for 20, 25, 30 years. It's kind of like, you know, at what point can they stop talking about it and do? But I think this one example was really wonderful. It was at a time where we had the Sure Start centres in England, but in Wales they had the Early Start centres, and it was an Early Start centre, and they'd created a really playful landscape, and alongside it was a training building. So during training hours, it was shut off to the public, and early years practitioners would go and they would use the space to learn about different techniques to playfully support learning and playfully support development. It was a really high play value site with very little play equipment. It was all about the landscape. There were beautiful meadows, there were lovely den areas, digging areas. It was absolutely enriched and beautiful. As soon as the training hours ended, the building was locked down, but the space was opened up to the public. So they used it in exactly that way that has just been referenced. It kind of was fluid between the different users of the space, whether it was public access. One thing I think is really interesting in this conversation about built environment is a lot of it is about policy and is about making those leadership decisions to say, you know, no, we're not going to feed our children plastic food. Why don't we use some of the excess waste and cook them proper food? Or no, we're not going, you know, my local school is next to a park. They have absolute access to that park, but it's the way in which they have suffered through pressure from curriculum requirements, having to make sure that they're taking care of the pastoral needs of the children, to the point where they don't have that lightness to be able to take the children into the park without, you know, huge risk assessments and, you know, fear of this stuff. So I think enabling people through policy, but also providing more people on the ground. I think one of the things that really has changed throughout the conversation we've had this evening, I've been reflecting on those black and white photographs. And typically one of the big differences between, say, myself and my generation was there were people in that environment, not just passers-by, but park rangers, youth workers. You know, you had people on the ground. Gender play, having people around is a really important aspect of making people feel safe, connected and supported. They're not interfering, but they're just there if you need them. And I think there's, yeah, so the environment, the built environment's really, really important. But part of it is also what's that social environment, what's that social protection that we're putting in place so people have somewhere to go if they need to talk.
Really beautiful, Beth. Thank you. It reminds me of the words of when I was studying my tutor, Signe Svalastoga, who's sadly not around anymore, but she talked about, wouldn't it be wonderful if schools could have caretakers who are allowed to be pedagogues? and that you can
Yes.
break down that boundary between the sort of maintenance and everyday shaping and looking after the space and the children. And we're sad to say, in some projects we've done, we're coming across schools where phone calls have to be made to big multinational companies to change light bulbs, let alone the thought of, you know, a child being involved in making something within their own realm. So absolutely, it needs to happen at policy and kind of leadership level.
I think that reminds me of that conversation. We gave the opportunity for some young people to design or involved with designing a new part of their school, and actually their first conversations were to ask the caretaker about the rhythm of their day, because they saw that value in that custodianship that they shared. But also nice conversations about the sort of intergenerationality, which I think leads really nicely on to Deborah's question. I don't know if Deborah, if you're still here, I can see, but if you wanted to ask that directly, maybe I thought it could be directed really nicely towards Joanna and Florian, maybe. I thought this is really interesting, and it certainly resonates with my thoughts.
I wasn't planning on putting my screen on, so please, I apologize for my background.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that was actually exactly when the question came up. I think that Joanna maybe said something about the space being used by different generations. My background is in informal education, particularly most of it in cultural organizations, so museums, libraries, archives. And one of the things that we focus on a lot is intergenerational exchanges, and also that flexibility that gets built in. I don't know, I have one weekend's experience in Berlin, but I was really struck by not just the creativity and the risk that was embedded in all of the playgrounds, but also the fact that I saw so many of them being used simultaneously in different ways by multiple ages, not because there were different spaces that have been created for those different ages, but because the same space was adaptable and opened up to being sort of creatively used. So I'm wondering about that. I think it also sort of connected to me to the catalytic action and that idea of, you know, if spaces are embedded in the city, that's part of what I think is so exciting about this conversation in general. We're not talking about sort of a sequestered space and the playground over there, but spaces that we happen upon. How does that encourage intergenerationality, and is that important? Is that something that we should be working on?
Joanna, Joanna or Florian, do you want to kick that off, and then maybe afterwards, Riccardo, we come to you, to your reflections. I'm thinking that's a lovely staircase.
I can definitely start. Yeah, I think thanks for the question. Unfortunately, this is my one experience of playground design, so it's quite limited. I can't necessarily speak for the whole of Berlin and how they approached this, but something that I think that was quite interesting was actually in preparing for this presentation and looking for the Google map image of the Radical Playgrounds, I came across the Google reviews of the Radical Playgrounds, and I'd never read them before, never looked at them, but it was quite interesting seeing the stark difference in opinions you got from different parents that had visited this space, where some of them had the approach where they said it was amazing how free their children could be and how they could use the space exactly as they wanted, and also the parents could use the space how they wanted. And often when we visited the site, we saw different groups of people gathering and just meeting and exchanging, and, you know, using some of the installations in ways that maybe we wouldn't have expected them to use in the first place. But then on the contrast, there were other reviews that said they didn't like how open and how the playground was planned, because they couldn't see their children at all times. And so I think part of it could come from a planning perspective, where it's great to have this kind of flexibility of the space and it can be used in different ways, but then also some of it has to come from the end user and understanding that maybe not all playgrounds are suitable for all people or how they want to use them. But then I guess the intergenerational planning, I think, is definitely a really important point, and one that I think it was during Lee's presentation, there was a quote maybe you had somewhere about how like climate change is the biggest risk for children in the future, and it just kind of highlights the fact that obviously we need to be designing these spaces for children to use and learn and, you know, express themselves, but also they maybe need to be kind of safe havens in a way where we can provide them with the space to play. But also with regard to climate change, often playgrounds and places like this provide shelter, they provide shade, they might provide drinking water, and things that are becoming more and more important in cities in the future as we experience climate change. And I think potentially that should also be integrated into this whole process of the design. Sorry, you're muted, Deborah.
I was just saying that was really interesting. I don't need to talk. Sorry, I was speaking to myself.
I see, Tim, you've got your hand up. Did you want to respond to that Joanna's point, and then we'll move on to Riccardo, and where we've got probably only a few minutes of people's time. There's one other really burning question I can see from Mohammed in the questions. We'll come to that at the end.
Just really quickly picking up on Joanna's point, I've shared some materials and resources around risk, and really there's a very lively conversation around risk and design and children. I just want to add to that, for people in the room who are involved in schemes and sites and designs, you know, you cannot give the most risk-averse parent a veto over what you put in, okay? Many parents want more adventurous and challenging spaces for their kids. Some are nervous about that. That's life. It's always been thus. But you cannot, in the nicest possible way, you cannot allow your, your point on that spectrum, your offer to children, to be effectively set by the most anxious parent. If you do, we all know where we will end up. And so, yes, have conversations and be respectful, but also be clear about what, you know, an adventurous place and offering children risky play experiences means. It means not, kind of complying with the wishes of the most anxious and vocal.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you for your contributions in the chat. I'm sure we're all going to find that very resourceful.
May I add something, because my mic is a bit on. I think this whole question of risk is a bit like an engineering, which is you can either take it as a really fixed value or something you constantly have to renegotiate. And I think especially our projects with Ramlabor, they're always the result of a collective process. It's quite interesting that some of the most innovative firms I've worked with, they're collectives. They're not hierarchically totally organized, but they allow themselves this process. And I think that helps us to have a variety of risk areas, so scale them up and down, but they're put together and we're allowed to play in them. So I think that's having listened to the call, I think it's or being it. I think this might help sometimes if you have from the beginning, was mentioned a number of times, a really heterogeneous group, and you work together as a collective.
Thank you very much, Florian. Riccardo, do you want to pick up on that point of cross-generational and maybe touch on risk as well a little bit? And then...
Yeah, very quickly on the intergenerational point, like this is fundamental in our work, and we came across this topic many times, but I would say that it basically goes down also to the fact that caregivers are going to these spaces with their children. So like not thinking about the caregivers is a mistake, because then what are the caregivers doing in the space? Then it ends up being the playground where the children are there, the caregivers are here. And that's not good relationship between the caregivers and the children. So we try to think about the spaces for everyone, and also like the caregivers want to play, they also want to have fun, you know, like many of them when they visit our projects, they are there interacting, playing with their kids, playing with the different features. So that's a bit how we approach all the projects. Yeah, on the point of risk, yeah, it's also a conversation that we have with different partners and with also with the caregivers. And the way we approach that is also like through a participatory process, so like discussing the risk and what are the concerns, and understand with people what level of risk is acceptable, for the different benefits and the types of play that we can incorporate in each space.
Thanks, Riccardo. Mohammed, I hope you don't mind, but I hope your question might have been, if not completely answered, then touched on in that final in that final point around risk for planners. I'd just like finally to ask the panelists, does anyone have a final thought that they would like to leave this afternoon with? Would anyone like to kick off? Maybe could I ask Lee?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So I think a great chat, really, really interesting, and for me, really important. And I think the fact that we're talking about play and design and planning and playful cities is really, really invigorating and important. I think from a policy point of view, unfortunately, sometimes I sit in the policy world rather than operational. I think it's really, really important to keep the conversation alive, to talk about things like risk, to talk about things like resourcing and investment and taking risks where we want to push the boundaries. So I think I'd like to thank everybody that contributed, and for anybody that's listening, please go away and advocate for really excellent planning and design that fulfills children's rights and gives them the chance to play and connect. That'd be great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Lee. Beth, can we pass to you?
Yeah, I'd just say I think the time for reflecting on whether it's a good idea is over. I think the time for action is definitely here. And I think that goes for climate crisis and looking for opportunities to create environments where our children can create innovative, adaptable, collaborative ways of working. Because I think in order for us to give them the best future that we can, we need to hold these spaces for them to find solutions amongst themselves.
Absolutely. And I can see Helen Taylor has added imagine a world where we start recruiting a lot more youth workers than police force. And I think that could be a wonderful thing. Riccardo, over to you.
Okay, closing remark. Yeah, no, I think it's very nice to be part of this panel, and like you know, our work is very limited to Lebanon, but I see a lot of connections with other realities, and yeah, just like thank you very much, and yeah, it was lovely to chat with all of you.
Thanks, Riccardo. We've certainly learned a lot from you. Florian and Joanna.
You want to go first, Joanna?
Up to you. You go ahead.
Well, I just have a very, very short, I think from the word of the planners, from the simulation, I realized it's a wonderful thing to keep curiosity and experimentation and playfulness as part of our tools which we have. It's so rarely as planners, we forget them normally in the first meeting and then they never come back. But I think trying to find opportunities and partners to have these chances to influence the environment in a more playful way, I think is wonderful.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I would just add to that, thank you for the opportunity to take part in the presentation and share our project. And I've definitely learned a lot from all of your work as well.
And we all need to get to Berlin before Sunday.
As soon as possible, yeah.
And finally, Tim.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Fiona, for giving me, I think, possibly the last word. Actually, you left a question hanging about the sort of children's appetite for experience. And is it, you know, I think playing is almost constitutive. It's what makes us human. And there's good evidence from anthropology, you know, speaking to just that. We are nature's most efficient learning machines, and mostly that's because of our playful impulses. And getting adults into thinking about their own childhoods and then bringing those insights into conversation about children today, using things like that play, you know, Right to Roam. I think that can almost always be a very effective way to elevate and energize this conversation. And I'd commend, you know, all of you to just bring it back to kind of about that, the place of play in our human lives and in children's lives, not just for their futures, but as part of their growing sense of their own agency and of how they navigate an uncertain world.
Tim, thank you. I think that's really lovely, and it kind of ties with one the point Simon Foxall made in the chat I saw there about the kind of the power of play wherever it exists as a motive for sort of collaboration and bringing people together and hopefully making, you know, better societies for us all. Fee, back over to you for closing out. Thank you for hosting.
Well, I was going to just to add my thanks to all the panelists. I've learned a huge amount. It's clear that there's a huge amount more work to be done, but I feel incredibly inspired and motivated by all of you to keep pushing this. It seems something which is so important to our humanity, as Tim says. And finally, I'm going to pass over to Ian Maddox from the Happold Foundation to give the final close. Thanks, Ian.
Hi, thank you so much. Yes, I'm Ian Maddox. I'm chair of the Happold Foundation, and I'm immensely proud of what we've put on this evening. I have to say, you're all wonderful people, and it was really inspiring to hear. So, thank you, Fiona, for a brilliant corralling of everyone. Everyone's presentations were very professional and very to the point, but the points were beautifully made. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Riccardo. Thank you, Lee, Beth, and Matthew, and of course Joanna and Florian. Particularly proud of what you did as well. I really enjoyed, learning about the theory and how it was just how it's been wonderfully put into practice. I really get it, and the additional insights that the sidebar has given us as well. I think there's a huge amount of great information in there. So thank you, everyone, and yeah, please carry on doing the wonderful things that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I hope you all have a lovely, playful evening, and if you're having to travel home from anywhere, you're doing it within a child-friendly city, human-friendly city.
Thank you all.
Amazing, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.